Have you ever felt a growing distance between you and your children, wondering where the connection went? Do you find yourself thinking back to the times when your relationship was close, only to realize that something has shifted? If so, you're not alone. In today's fast-paced world, many parents experience this emotional gap, and it's easy to feel isolated, frustrated, and even misunderstood. As families become busier, the simple moments of connection seem to slip away, leaving behind feelings of distance and emotional exhaustion. In this video, we're going to explore the complexities of parent-child relationships in a world that's constantly moving forward. Through heartfelt stories and real-life experiences, we will offer practical strategies to bridge the gap, foster mutual respect, and cultivate understanding between you and your children. These tools are meant to help you manage your emotions effectively, avoid unnecessary conflicts, and create an environment at home where both parents and children can thrive together, no matter the stage of life. As we dive deeper into the topic, you'll discover actionable tips that can completely transform the dynamics of your family. You'll hear inspiring stories of families just like yours, whose experiences of overcoming challenges have led to stronger, more meaningful connections. From navigating the emotional roller coaster of teenage rebellion to dealing with the complexities of adult estrangement, or even the challenges of aging together, this video will offer valuable insights that you can apply in your own life. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss out on any of our future content. Your support means the world to me, and if this video resonates with you, please consider liking and sharing it with others who might benefit from these lessons. Together, we can build a community that encourages healthier family dynamics and deeper emotional connections. And now, as we begin, I want to hear from you. If you find this topic interesting, please comment 1 below. If not, leave a 0 and let me know what you'd like to see more of. Your feedback helps me improve and bring you content that's valuable and meaningful to you. Now, let's dive into today's video. In the popular television show Changing Seasons, the story follows a young protagonist named Jake Harrison, who was born into a wealthy family with every luxury imaginable. Raised in the lap of comfort, Jake had everything he could ever ask for, yet his parents were always preoccupied with their busy careers and seldom paid attention to his upbringing or education. As a result, Jake became rebellious, running away from home, causing trouble, and getting into frequent fights. His disrespect for authority grew over time, and sadly, this included a lack of respect for his parents. On his first day at a family ranch, Jake's behavior took a turn for the worse. As the staff began organizing his luggage, Jake became frustrated, lost control, and struck someone in anger. Upon arriving at his grandfather's house on the ranch, he continued to display an arrogant and defiant attitude. It was clear he had little regard for the simple, rural lifestyle his grandparents led. However, his grandparents, who had spent their lives cultivating patience and understanding, did not respond with anger. Instead, they greeted Jake with warmth and a smile, offering him a homemade meal prepared with care. In the evening, Jake's grandmother walked for hours along the mountain paths, her thoughts focused on her grandson, hoping he would find his way and pursue his education with diligence. After living with his grandparents for more than a month, Jake's hardened heart began to soften. The unconditional love and silent devotion of his grandparents slowly but surely broke through the walls of resentment he had built. No longer the angry, rebellious young man who had arrived, Jake began to reflect on his past actions and his treatment of those around him. Upon returning to the city, he was a changed person, approaching his parents with newfound understanding. He sought reconciliation and wanted to reconnect, trying to spend more meaningful time with them. Over time, Jake continued to keep in touch with his grandparents, who, despite their distance, always remembered him with love, sending well wishes at every family celebration. This story illustrates an important lesson about the dynamics of respect within families. When children act out, ignore you, or refuse to show respect, the first step in bridging the gap is to manage your own emotions. Anger, while a natural reaction, will only harm the relationship further. The key to dissolving resentment lies in warmth and love. Responding with compassion can work wonders in healing emotional wounds, as it did with Jake. This reminds me of a story shared by an educator, Mr. Thomas, who once taught a particularly disruptive class. On the first day of the semester, the students were loud and unruly. One girl, seated in the front row, kept slamming her books on the desk, creating a constant noise that made it difficult for anyone to focus. Eventually, she began coughing loudly, and her disruptive behavior escalated. At that moment, Mr. Thomas was tempted to simply yell at her or ask her to leave the classroom, but instead, he chose a more compassionate approach. He calmly walked up to her, handed her some cough drops, and encouraged her to take care of herself. The girl was taken aback, and her behavior changed immediately. The classroom, once chaotic, became quiet and orderly for the rest of the lesson. Napoleon once said, "He who can control his emotions is greater than a general who conquers cities." Maintaining emotional composure, especially when dealing with our children, is one of the most powerful tools we can have. Not only does it minimize conflicts, but it also leads to more effective solutions. If you want your children to respect you and care for you, it is essential to keep your temper in check, regardless of the situation. A loud, authoritative voice doesn't necessarily mean you're right. Sometimes, silence is the most effective response. By choosing silence over confrontation, you allow time and reflection to reveal the truth. A peaceful, calm household is the foundation for overcoming any challenge. Another important principle is to avoid arguments whenever possible. Sometimes, the best approach is to step back and let the situation cool down. Benjamin Franklin wisely noted that arguments are like a game where no one truly wins. In family life, especially between parents and children, it's easy to let frustration take over and fall into the trap of unnecessary disputes. Take, for example, the experience of Tom Harrison, an elderly man who was growing increasingly frustrated with his daughter, Emily. Tom felt like his daughter was drifting away from him, and every conversation seemed to end in a fight. Emily, now an adult, tried to share details of her life with her father, but Tom couldn't help but interrupt. "Why don't you settle down and find a partner?" he would say. "You're an adult now. Don't you think it's time to take life more seriously?" When Emily expressed interest in changing jobs, Tom responded with a dismissive comment. "Why can't you keep a job? Persistence is key." If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. One day, Tom became excited about the idea of learning something new, video editing. However, when Emily offered to teach him, Tom quickly lost his patience and began complaining. "After all these years, I can't believe you won't teach me something so simple." This pattern of conversation, where every exchange turned into a heated argument, became the norm, and both father and daughter ended up feeling distant and hurt. As time went on, Emily's relationship with her father, Tom, became more strained. She grew increasingly reserved, shutting down emotionally as his constant criticisms took their toll. Some parents, particularly those who are overly strict or inflexible, unintentionally prevent their children from making decisions on their own or learning from their mistakes. When children rebel, as Emily did, parents often respond with even more severity, which only deepens the divide. Instead of understanding the cause of the rebellion, the parent's harsh response generates more tension and frustration, leading to a cycle of conflict that becomes harder to break. As parents, when you feel that your children are not respecting you or paying attention to your concerns, it's essential to take a step back and adopt a more objective stance. The first step is to acknowledge your own mistakes and set a good example for them. If you have been wrong, admit it. This demonstrates humility and encourages your children to reflect on their actions. If they are at fault, avoid using your authority to force your opinion on them, as this will only fuel their rebellion. Instead, remain calm and composed, even when it's difficult. Sometimes, withholding objections and responding with quiet firmness can be the most powerful approach. This creates space for your children to come to their conclusions, and it helps guide them towards self-reflection. This idea brings to mind a quote by the French author François de la Rochefoucauld, who once said, "To think that two people can share the same thoughts, judgments, and desires is the most ridiculous idea. It is neither feasible nor desirable." In the parent-child relationship, disagreements often arise not because one side is right and the other wrong, but because each generation has different experiences, values, and expectations. These generational gaps are the root cause of many misunderstandings. Younger people, lacking the life experience of their parents, may dismiss their advice, while older adults, having seen and lived through so much, tend to become more rigid and repetitive. In this scenario, the most effective approach is to show greater empathy and tolerance. It is important to understand that both parents and children have their own struggles and emotional burdens. Instead of fighting or arguing, it's wise to step back, give each other space, and acknowledge that each generation faces unique challenges. As parents age and their children mature, the dynamics of the relationship must evolve. It's essential to shift into a role that adapts to the changing needs of both parties. Understanding what your children are going through daily and accepting their negative emotions, rather than reacting to them with judgment, will create a stronger, more balanced connection. The key to maintaining harmony within the family is to focus on the time you have together and cherish the moments you can share. Taking care of your own emotional well-being, your health, and planning wisely for your future will help you approach aging with greater peace of mind. This is the wisest choice you can make, especially as you move into your later years. Additionally, as we grow older, we must recognize that some things are better left unsaid. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, in his work The Wisdom of Life, advised that we should keep our matters private, things that others cannot see with their own eyes. Sharing too much about our struggles can make us vulnerable to judgment. In many families, difficulties are often discussed openly, but when these matters reach the ears of outsiders, they rarely receive the sympathy they deserve. Instead, people often become the subject of ridicule or gossip, which only escalates family conflicts. This lesson is illustrated by a story of a farmer named Jack Thompson, who lived in a small village in the rural American South. Jack had 2 sons, Henry and George, and 3 daughters. While the daughters had married and moved out, the 2 sons remained single and lived at home. Jack, who had never received a formal education, was very vocal about his family matters, often discussing them with his neighbors. His sons, feeling the pressure of his harsh criticisms, became resentful, frequently clashing with their father. Though they enjoyed spending late nights playing poker, they always returned home to Jack, who was always ready to voice his displeasure with their behavior. Tired of his son's behavior, Jack would often complain to his neighbors, and before long, the entire village knew about his son's disobedience and their late-night habits. Jack intended to motivate them by expressing his frustration, hoping they would settle down and find responsibility. He believed that if they married, they would become more mature and stable. Jack did everything in his power to arrange suitable marriages for his sons. But word had spread about their bad behavior, and no families were willing to marry their daughters to them. Despite their love for poker, Henry and George were hard-working and responsible in other areas, and when Jack fell ill, both sons took care of him without hesitation. However, the gossip that Jack had shared with his neighbors had done irreparable damage. As the saying goes, bad news travels fast, and the damage to their reputations made it difficult for the brothers to find partners. Some children may show a lack of interest or even disrespect toward their parents, but deep down, they still long to be valued and appreciated. This often stems from a need for validation, something that every child craves, no matter how independent they may seem. When parents consistently point out their children's mistakes or shortcomings, especially in public or in front of others, it can deeply affect their children's self-esteem. Constant criticism, particularly in front of an audience, can damage the child's perception of themselves and lead to feelings of humiliation and resentment. In more critical cases, children may begin to retreat emotionally, ultimately reaching a state of self-deception or resignation. They may convince themselves that they are beyond hope, or that their efforts to gain their parents' approval are futile. As parents, it is our responsibility to step into a compassionate role. Conflicts within the family should be dealt with privately, behind closed doors, rather than airing the family's dirty laundry in public. The home should be a sanctuary where we protect each other's dignity, not a battleground for emotional power struggles. Every family has its share of challenges, but it is essential to approach each other with understanding, patience, and care. It is vital to be cautious with our words and not let the frustration of the moment drive us to say things that we might regret later. While it's natural for parents and children to have differences, we must always safeguard the emotional integrity of our family members. This means defending each other, both within and outside the family, and not allowing outsiders to judge or criticize our relationships. The home should remain a safe space, a place where harmony is nurtured, and where everyone feels supported. As parents, we can only influence our children's futures to the extent that we model the kind of emotional stability and maturity we want them to embody. Our attitudes and reactions have a lasting impact on their emotional development. A peaceful, calm, and understanding approach fosters an environment where both parents and children can grow together. When faced with disrespect or emotional distance, it's important to remain serene, avoid escalating conflicts, and understand that victory in every argument is not the goal. What's truly important is preserving the bond with our children, allowing them to mature while maintaining a nurturing and supportive environment. In life, what we all crave more of is understanding and tolerance, not criticism and complaints. When we embrace these values, we create a home that is not only welcoming but also happy. A happy home is one where family members lift each other, where disagreements are handled with compassion, and where love and respect are always at the forefront. Let me share a personal story that exemplifies some of these lessons. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 65 years old. For the past decade, I dedicated much of my time to caring for my daughter's children. At first, it seemed like a rewarding way to spend my golden years. However, a specific event opened my eyes to the true nature of my relationship with my daughter and her husband. For most of my life, I was a school teacher, passionate about helping children grow and learn. After retiring over 10 years ago, I received a monthly pension of $4,800, which allowed me to live comfortably. My husband passed away years ago, and while I never remarried, I focused on being there for my daughter. I didn't want to remarry if it meant disrupting her life, so I remained single, figuring it was best for her peace of mind. However, as time went on, I began considering the possibility of finding a companion to share my later years with. After all, life doesn't stop when you hit a certain age, and I longed for someone to enjoy the golden years with. But when I discussed this idea with my daughter, she was completely against it. She argued that remarrying would just mean I would become a free nanny for some man, and that I would receive nothing in return. At first, I was hurt by her words, but over time, I understood where she was coming from. She was trying to protect me, though it wasn't the way I had hoped. At that moment, I seriously considered the possibility of remarrying. I had a close friend, someone with whom I had always gotten along well. He was kind and supportive, and seemed to be a good match. He had even expressed a desire for us to live together, which made me think that perhaps it was time to take that step. After all, we were both in the later stages of life, and companionship seemed like a natural choice. But when I brought it up to my daughter, she was adamant against it. She told me that remarrying would only mean I would become a free nanny for some man, and that I would gain nothing from it. At the time, I didn't fully understand her perspective, but I decided to respect her wishes and set my thoughts about remarriage aside. Instead, my daughter reassured me that if I ever felt too lonely, she and her husband would take care of me in my old age. She said that I could always help with her children, and that would fill my time. When my grandson was born, I took on the role of caregiver, and my life became centered around him. 4 years, my entire world revolved around my family and taking care of them. But over the next 10 years, living in my daughter's house became more exhausting than my years spent as a teacher. When I worked, I had set days off and vacation time. But living in their home, I was on duty every single day, morning until night, with no break in sight. I didn't have a single day off to myself. It might sound like an exaggeration, but there were days when I felt I could barely breathe. So consumed was I with the demands of helping raise my grandson, keeping the house running, and taking care of their daily needs. Though my daughter and her husband provided me with a small monthly allowance of $300, it wasn't enough to cover everything. I spent most of it just on food and daily necessities. For everything else, I relied on my pension, which was barely enough to cover my expenses. Every month, I had to dip into my savings, which were meant for my future. It was a constant struggle, and in the 10 years I lived with them, I'd spent nearly as much as it would take to buy a small house. Money seemed to slip away as quickly as it came. But I continued to justify it to myself. After all, my daughter was my only family. When I got older and could no longer care for myself, I would rely on her, so it only made sense to spend what I had to support her and her family. I thought to myself, who else would I spend on if not them? But my perspective changed one day in April when I had a serious accident while riding my moped to buy some groceries. I had been feeling a little dizzy, but I didn't think much of it. I lost my concentration, and before I knew it, I crashed into a car. Thankfully, the driver was very kind and immediately took me to the hospital. As I sat in the back of the car, feeling exhausted and overwhelmed, I called my daughter. Her husband arrived soon after I was admitted. At first, I was relieved, thinking they were concerned about my health. But as they spoke, I realized something was off. "Mom, can you see the license plate? We need to make sure that person pays," my daughter said, her voice sounding more like someone discussing a business deal than a concerned daughter. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 2 below to let me know that you are still here with me. They seemed more focused on securing compensation than my well-being. I was too tired to argue, so I simply responded, it wasn't anyone's fault. I got dizzy and crashed. They didn't ask for money, and they even took me to the hospital. We should be grateful for their help. I fractured my fibula, and I'll need months to recover. I can't thank them in person yet, but I gave them their contact info. I've asked them to go on my behalf and deliver a small gift and a red envelope as a token of gratitude. There was an uncomfortable silence from my daughter and her husband, and they didn't say anything in response. Shortly after, my son-in-law's phone rang, and he apologized, saying he had work matters to attend to. Then, he left. I was left alone in the hospital, recovering from my injury. I spent almost 2 weeks there, and apart from that first visit, my son-in-law never came to see me again. My daughter would call every day to ask how I was doing, but her visits were so infrequent that I could count them on one hand. She explained to me that her job was just too demanding for her to take any time off. I understood, but it didn't make me feel any less alone. Even when I was in the hospital, struggling with pain and uncertainty, I couldn't help but feel that the support I had always offered them was no longer being reciprocated. My daughter didn't even take a day off to help care for me. The distance between us had grown in a way I never imagined. The emotional strain was overwhelming. The hospital where I was recovering from my injury was only about 3 kilometers from my daughter's house, yet it felt like an entire world away. During my stay, I was taken in by an elderly woman, Mrs. Martin, who had no idea I had children. She often offered me food when her daughter would bring it for her, and she would kindly share little stories about her life. I never corrected her assumption that I had no family. The truth was, at that moment, I felt as though I didn't have a daughter. When it was time for me to be discharged from the hospital, I reached out to my daughter and son-in-law to help with the medical expenses. My bill had exceeded $3,000, and even though I could recover part of it, I was still left with over $1,000 to pay out of my pocket. The strain was already too much, and their response left me feeling deeply disillusioned. "We would love to help, but our salaries aren't very high," my son-in-law said with an air of resignation. "We have so many financial commitments, and honestly, our bank account is empty. We just can't afford to do anything more." He told me that he earned around $700 a month, and my daughter a little more than $500. They gave me $300 a month for expenses, but even that barely covered the basics. It was clear that they had the means to help, but they chose not to. At that moment, I felt a coldness in my heart toward my daughter. After years of sleepless nights, sacrifices, and emotional labor, I had always stood by her. I had been a mother who had respected her decisions, who had supported her every step of the way. I felt like I had been a good mother. How could she not see that? "You know I've always been there for you," I said to my daughter, my voice trembling. "I've never failed you. In the past 10 years, I've given everything I have to you and your family. Now that I need help, don't you think it's time for you to help me? I've spent my pension supporting you. Why can't you help me with this?" But instead of offering any kind of support, my daughter insisted that I needed to understand their situation. "We just can't right now, Mom. We're doing the best we can," she said, almost as if it was my fault for asking. At that moment, I realized that I could no longer depend on her. She had always appreciated what I gave her, but she never once tried to put herself in my shoes. It had always been a one-sided relationship, with me giving and her receiving without any real acknowledgement or reciprocation. Despite everything, though, I didn't want to let go of the hope that she might come around. Maybe that's just what being a mother means, holding on to the belief that your child will eventually see things your way. But deep down, I knew that I could no longer trust her to be there for me when I needed her most. Her priorities, I now saw clearly, were her husband and children, not me. And that hurt more than I could express. I was forced to accept the reality that my daughter was not the person I had hoped she would be in my time of need. I had given her everything, and now, in return, she couldn't even help with my medical bills. The harsh truth stung, but I didn't dwell on it for too long. I had to face it. My expectations had been unrealistic, and I was the one left with the emotional burden. After I was discharged, I decided to stop waiting for my daughter to show up. I didn't want to burden her further. I called my older sister, Susan, and asked her to come pick me up. She arrived with my 2 grandchildren, and we went to her house. I was grateful to be with someone who truly cared. Living alone was going to be difficult, especially with my leg still injured, but my sister insisted on staying with me. She took care of me, preparing healthy meals to aid in my recovery. My grandchildren also visited frequently, bringing joy and warmth into my days. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of envy toward my sister. Her children were attentive and thoughtful, and showed genuine love for her. I couldn't help but notice that, despite being a few years older than me, my sister seemed so much younger. Maybe it was because she didn't carry the weight of unmet expectations and emotional stress that I had been holding onto for so long. It made me realize how much the act of worrying and carrying resentment could age you. Her lightness, her ability to let things go, was a lesson I would carry with me moving forward. My relationship with my daughter was something I could no longer change. It was painful, but the only thing I could control was how I chose to live the rest of my life. From that point forward, I would save my money for myself and no longer invest in her. I was already 65, and I needed to live with my eyes wide open. I had spent so much of my life giving, and now I had to focus on my well-being. A few years ago, my mother passed away. At 72, my father decided to marry a 48-year-old woman who had been taking care of him. At first, I thought it was a positive step. Perhaps she genuinely loved him and wasn't just after his money or his house. But when my sister Minju dug deeper into the situation, she found out that the woman had left before, and that raised suspicions. She had been with my father for 6 months, and I didn't want him to be taken advantage of. I warned her, but the caregiver left without a word, and my father continued to deny the truth. Now, I find myself in a similar situation. My father, still heartbroken from the passing of my mother, wanted to marry this caregiver, claiming that she loved him deeply. But when I confronted her, she too left without a backward glance. My father still insists that I'm ruining his beautiful love story, but the truth is, I have to protect him from making the same mistakes again. My name is Ingrid Thompson, and I'm 52 years old. I retired from my job 2 years ago, and now my only son is still attending school while my husband continues to work. I'm an only child, and growing up, I was cherished by my parents. They showered me with love and care, providing me with everything I could ever need. I had toys, private English lessons, and even piano classes. I was the only child in my group of friends, and it seemed like everyone envied me for it. I felt fortunate in my youth, as though the world was laid out before me, filled with endless opportunities and happiness. However, as time passed and my mother became seriously ill, I began to realize the challenges of being an only child. It's a complicated role, especially when the time comes to take care of aging parents. On one hand, I had the responsibility of caring for my parents, but on the other, I had to manage my duties to my in-laws, my husband, and my son. It often felt as though life had stacked the cards against me, not giving one person the luxury of fully enjoying all of life's blessings. In my younger years, I never imagined this kind of stress, but as I entered middle age, I found myself faced with the same hardships that others had dealt with before me. It was a difficult realization. When my mother's condition worsened, I decided to take an extended leave from my work to care for her. My in-laws, however, were not happy with my decision. They felt it was inconvenient, and I could sense their disapproval. Thankfully, my husband was supportive. He reminded me that being filial is a responsibility that must be honored while our parents are still with us. Once they are gone, there will be no more chances to fulfill that duty. His words gave me the strength to put aside my personal needs and focus on my mother. After my mother passed away, I tried to convince my father to move in with me, but he refused. He felt he needed to stay in his own home and take care of his routine. It was clear that he didn't want to uproot himself. So, I arranged for a caregiver to assist him. At first, I hired women over 50 to come in and prepare meals and do light cleaning. But after my retirement, I began visiting my father more frequently. It was during these visits that I noticed something had changed. He had hired a new caregiver, one who was much younger. At first, I thought she was in her early 30s, but when I spoke with her, I learned that she was actually 48 and recently divorced. She didn't seem to have as complicated a life as she had led me to believe. I was a little suspicious, so I decided to look into her background more closely. I examined her ID, and something about it struck me as strange. When I asked her who had introduced her to my father, she said it was a domestic services agency. I pressed further, asking her to clarify, and she explained that she was a distant relative from her hometown. After her divorce, she had no income and decided to become a caregiver. Something didn't sit right with me. She claimed to be from a rural area, where she had worked on a farm taking care of children and doing household chores. But as I looked at her hands, which were surprisingly soft and delicate, far softer than mine, I started to question the validity of her story. It didn't add up. After I left my father's house, I went to a neighbor's home to gather more information about this woman. The neighbor didn't know much about her either, except that she was indeed related to the caregiver. I asked if she was really 48 years old and had always been living with my father, but the neighbor couldn't confirm any details. He seemed just as unsure as I was about her background. A few days later, my father called me to come back to the house. He had something important he wanted to discuss. When I arrived, he told me that he was considering marrying the caregiver. He said that he wanted to offer her a home and, in return, have her support him in his old age. I was shocked, to say the least. I asked the caregiver if I should speak with her children about the situation, to which she replied, "I don't have any children. I was divorced, and that's why I had to leave my home." I suggested to my father that he go to the park and play chess with a neighbor while I spoke with the caregiver privately. However, he insisted that I have the conversation in front of him. I refused, saying I didn't want to discuss anything personal in front of him. I wasn't going to engage in what felt like a ridiculous conversation about a woman who had barely been in his life for 6 months. The caregiver seemed taken aback, clearly confused by my refusal to entertain the idea. She fidgeted nervously on the couch while I led my father to the elevator. Once we got to the elevator, I turned back to the caregiver and told her that I had spoken with the neighbor. The caregiver asked me, "What did you go to speak with the neighbor about?" I looked at her calmly and replied, "The neighbor mentioned that you have 3 children, so I'm confused as to why you told me you don't." At that moment, she visibly tensed up, not knowing how to respond. Her unease was obvious. Her body language spoke volumes. She looked down, unsure of where to place her hands, and I could see that my words had struck a chord. I then continued, "This house has been in my name since my mother passed away, and my father's only income is his small pension. He has about $2,000 in savings, but everything else is in my name. If you're not being truthful with me, I will have no choice but to call the authorities or end your employment here." At this, she immediately stood up from the sofa, flustered, and handed me a piece of paper on which she had scrawled some dates. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 3 below to let me know that you are still here with me. I silently observed her as she explained that the paper was a record of her time spent caring for my father. I had seen similar tactics before, people trying to cover their tracks with carefully crafted stories and documentation. I wasn't fooled. "Please wait here for a moment," I said, and then I excused myself. I returned with the security camera footage from the house, showing her actions over the last few weeks. I calmly handed her the recording. "Take a look," I said, as I played back the footage. The recordings revealed everything. She had entered the house to collect her belongings, and she hadn't forgotten to ask me to pay her for the full month's work. "You only worked half the month," I said firmly. "If you want to receive the full payment, you'll have to leave my father's home properly and respectfully." She went into the kitchen to prepare a meal, and I decided that after lunch, I would inform my father of everything that had transpired. When my father returned home for lunch, he immediately sensed that something was off between the two of us. He asked me what was going on, and I told him that the caregiver would explain everything to him. After the meal, I went to my room to rest, giving them space to talk. I wanted to allow my father to hear her side without my interference. The caregiver told my father that her mother, who lived in a village, had called to inform her that she was in the hospital and needed her help. She explained that she needed to leave immediately to care for her. When my father heard this, he generously went to his bedside table and pulled out a decent amount of money. He wanted to give her something for her troubles. She hesitated, knowing she was probably being recorded, and refused the money. "I've already been paid my salary for the month," she said, her voice steady but forced. My father, not understanding the full extent of the situation, insisted. "Please take something, just as a gesture of gratitude," he said. He wasn't trying to intervene, but his kindness couldn't let him offer anything. So, he took out another $20, which he offered to her. In the living room, I heard her saying goodbye, saying, "Sister, I'm leaving." I stood up to leave as well, not wanting to make a scene. I wished her a good trip as I walked to the door. My father stayed behind, sitting on the sofa, looking confused and reflective. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't want her to go, but deep down, I knew that his desire for companionship had clouded his judgment. Despite the situation, I understood my father's loneliness. It's a natural desire for older men to seek companionship in their later years. I couldn't fault him for wanting someone by his side, but I could not stand by and watch him fall into the hands of someone so clearly disingenuous. This woman was not the right match for him. She had used him for her benefit, and it was painful to see him so blinded by his need for companionship. What I found most troubling was the fact that the neighbor never once mentioned that the caregiver had children, and I was the one who had to ask questions to uncover the truth. Deceitful people are always more cautious, and her sudden nervousness confirmed that something was off. The fact that she had shown me the security camera footage only made it clearer who was being deceived. Among women, some things do not need to be explicitly said. There are unspoken understandings that can't be ignored. As we wrap up today's video, I hope these stories have given you some valuable insights into family dynamics, responsibility, and the importance of emotional balance. From Ingrid's experience of caring for her aging parents to navigating the complexities of trust and love within family relationships, there's so much we can learn. It's not always easy to manage family expectations, but it's important to remember that respect, patience, and understanding go a long way in maintaining healthy connections with our loved ones. So, what have you learned from today's video? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below with one thing you've learned from this story that you plan to bring into your own life and practice moving forward. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an update. Your support means the world, and I appreciate you being a part of this community. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.